Hello, class, and welcome to Chapter 6 of your textbook, Physiology and Psychophysics. So, what's all this about? I want you to get in this frame of mind, right? This is the new medical science, right? And they're trying to figure out exactly what's going on with the body, right? Now, it was hugely in vogue. Even a gentleman that's on one of our pieces of currency, Benjamin Franklin. As you know, he was a diplomat and an ambassador, but he was also a scientist. And found in one of his houses a bunch of bodies in the basement. Now you're thinking to yourself, Benjamin Franklin, you murderer. No, during the time, it was not unheard of to hire men to go dig in the graveyard and to bring you back fresh bodies. Yeah, that's what happened. And Ben Franklin, he was a student of science and was exploring this new and novel realm of studying the body. Now, scientific advances, right? It started to help us address the question of what were the mechanisms that represent consciousness. Because you think about it, up until now, we have really philosophers that are kind of waxing poetic about how the mind works. But now we're actually starting to be able to measure certain things, people's perceptions. We're starting to look at where nerves go in the body. We're getting away from this idea of just spiritualism, that there's humors or spirits that move in the body. And one of the key things, and I mentioned this in my cognitive psych, if you're in there, was astronomy, right? They're starting to study the movements of planets. And what they noticed that from lab to lab and individual to individual, that there is differences in their recordings of the movements of planets. And they quickly start to uncover this idea that it's not the instrument, right? It's the person. That their ability to respond to stimuli varies from person to person. So some of the very first experiments that look at our ability to perceive stimuli are actually these reaction time because of this research. Because if you're just a few, even a quarter of a second off on measuring a planet, that's a huge distance because the planets are so far away. So they need very precise measurements. I mean, nowadays we use lasers and photoreceptors and all that kind of stuff and just kind of remove the human being out of it. So, objective and subjective differences. So these reaction time studies kind of make us aware that there's a lot of human differences. And it seems obvious, right? You're probably thinking in your head like, duh, we're all a little different, right? But really, there was a school of thought that there was a point-to-point similarity. What happens in the environment is directly represented in the mind, right? That's not true. Now it seems obvious to you, right? And I'm going to let you in on a little secret here. A lot of what I'm going to talk about, if you've taken any biology class, is going to be like, yeah, of course it's that way. But you got to take it from the perspective of we didn't know that at the time, right? We weren't sure exactly what's going on. I mean, you could imagine that, push on your finger, your body feels, a press on your finger. That's a one-to-one reaction. You're feeling the exact same. And there's beliefs that there's spirits that kind of transmit the information. We talked about it before that, like, God may have been a middleman for these senses and perceptions. But now science is starting to get in. We're starting to take a very deep dive into the physiology of the body We're looking at organs, heart structures, but the brain is a physical part. We're trying to figure out what senses it's picking up, where is information coming from. And again, you're going to say, oh, I know this, professor, but you really got to think, back then, they didn't. Okay, the Bell-Magendie Law. So there's a big debate who found it first, right? Bell was in the process, or published, and Magendie was in the process of publishing. So they basically just stuck it together. So two guys found this, bitter rivals, right? But what they found was that the sensory nerves entered the dorsal root of the spinal cord, and the motor emerged from the ventricle. So what does this mean? So if you think about a dolphin, it has a dorsal fin on top, right? So the nerves go up into the dorsal. Ventral means underneath, so the motor nerves are going underneath. This means that there's a separation between what's being perceived and the movement of the body. Again, you're like, yeah, but this was groundbreaking at the time. We didn't know that sensation and perception, sensation and movement were separated between two different anatomy structures. This kind of starts us on this path to start to think about how different areas process information in the brain. So we know now, for instance, the right hemisphere, right, controls the left side of your body and vice versa. They didn't know that back then. So no longer can you just say nerves convey some vibrations. Yes, vibrations, they thought, or spiritual energy. We know that they're actually they're processing or conveying different sensations and movements. What else? Suggests a separate sensory motor region in the brain for processing the information. So again, we're getting closer and closer to understanding the certain areas of the brain process certain information. Okay, the doctrine of specific nerve energies. So this is from Muller, from his research. He demonstrated that for each of the five senses, they pick up certain characteristic sensations. Okay, what does this mean? Okay, so each nerve responds in its own way regardless of the stimuli which activate it. So we have, say, pressure sensitive neurons on our finger. We have sensory neurons, right, that pick up pressure on our finger, all over our body, of course. But regardless of what creates the sensation, right, if I push on my finger, if someone else pushes on my finger, if I smack my finger, if I punch my finger, regardless of what creates the pressure, it's still going to be the exact same stimulation, or neuron's going to act in its way to respond. And each sensory system is maximally sensitive to a specific type. But that doesn't mean it's the only type that can set it off, right? So they start to understand that, yeah, pressure can set it off, but there could potentially be hot or cold that can initiate some activity if there's an adequate amount, right? If there's a lot. And this seems obvious. Again, the central nervous system, not the physical stimulus, determines the sensation, right? Again, it's not the push or the cold or the hot that is creating the sensation. It's the receptor, right? Think about it this way. Think about a camera, like the camera on your smartphone, because nobody carries around a camera anymore because you got one in your pocket, right? So the light right? The light is not creating the image that you see on the screen when you take a picture, right? The camera is creating the image by sensing the light coming into it. And you can really see this if you take a look at maybe some of your really old pictures from your first or second generation iPhone compared to like the new sweet one with like 3 or 4 or 5. It's ridiculous how many lenses they have, right? The light's always the same, right? Pretty much, right? You could go and take a picture of the exact same thing with these different versions of the camera, but as the camera gets better and better through iteration of the phone, the picture looks better. So the light is not creating the picture. I know you're like, well, of course it's creating picture. No, it's actually the receptors, the light receptors in the camera that are picking up the light, right, are being stimulated by the light of the camera and then interpreting that and creating a photo from it, right? That's actually what our bodies are doing too. So when light enters our eye, it actually falls on the back of our retina. There's a lot of interpretation that goes on. It's the central nervous system that's actually creating our vision based upon what's being stimulated in the eye. And all our senses work like that. Seems kind of obvious, but again, we're going to run this issue. Yeah, I know, Professor, but they didn't. Okay, on to Hermann von Helmholtz. I was actually knighted by the Prussian government. That's why we had the von in there. So I just want you to be kind of aware of a lot of this chapter focuses on individuals and their contributions, but they're super important to moving this field forward. So Helmholtz was a poor child, but very smart, very intelligent. He agreed to serve as a medical doctor for the Prussian army for medical training. And then actually very quickly, because of his tremendous research and findings, the government allowed him out of military service, and he served as several professorships. So very, very influential. He even started a group of physiologists that were bent on taking down the vitalism movement. What is vitalism? It seems ridiculous, but it's the idea that the life force is beyond physical and chemical processes alone, right? That there's something inherently spiritual about it. And you could say, well, yeah, sure, Professor, this kind of sounds like religion, it's a little bit. But no, this was a part of the biological science, was this idea of some vitalism around it. I mean, we still have vitalism now. I mean, if you believe in a soul, that means there's more than just the chemical reactions, right? So you're like, oh, that sounds ridiculous, but it's a key part of a lot of people's belief system still. Does it belong in science? Not so much. And that's what Helmholtz would definitely say. So he was fighting against this idea of the life force. And since there was a life force in the body, you couldn't study life itself. And he created this, what's called a materialist position, or the materialistic movement. And he really stated that if you look deep enough about the physical and chemical processes of life, then you can actually study it scientifically, and you can get away from this idea of a life force. The frog. So he really demonstrated this idea of conservation of energy. So physics is going on, and it came up with this idea that energy is not lost or created. It's just transformed, right? It's still a prevalent idea. It's one of the cornerstones of physics. No energy is created or lost. It's just transformed, right? And Helmholtz applied this idea to our buddy the frog right there. And he measured the heat created by a frog versus how much food went in, food went out. And he clearly showed that there was a conservation of energy within the organism, right? What you put in minus the heat that got out and what it pooed or peed out, right, was equal to what went in. And that was a new idea, because this idea that you can actually take physics and begin to measure the heat input, the chemical processes, rather than some mysterious force. And this actually got him out of the Prussian army, so that's a plus for Hermann. Okay, so he's not done yet, right? He really talked about the idea that sensations are the raw elements of experience, and that our perception is how we give meaning based upon our past experiences. Seems obvious, right? So what you pick up, say you see somebody across the room and you're like, oh, that's Joe over there, my buddy Joe. And then we've had this happen, right? The person turns around and they're like, oh, whoa, oh, that's not Joe. I thought it was him. They look a lot alike, right? But what happened was you were getting sensations in your brain, and then from the top down, you were putting your perception. You're like, I think that's Joe, right? Big, huge idea. I mean, it seems obvious to us now, but maybe not. And he created one of the very first theories about color vision, right? So light, if you have a red light, a green light, and a blue light, you can create any type of light from that, right? Depending upon how you mix it. Now, you should know that light is a little bit different than how pigmentation works. So if you use paints, you're like, well, wait a minute, Professor, I thought yellow was a primary color. It is if you're painting, but light's a little bit different. So we have a blue, red, and green receptor, Helmholtz said. And depending on how these receptors are stimulated and in different rates, you can combine into any color. This is called the trichromatic theory of color vision. And it was kind of right. This gets a little bit more into psychology and how we study vision, but there's things that his theory couldn't explain, such as color blindness, right? So you have individuals that are red-green colorblind, but they can see more than just blue. So he didn't really explain color blindness that well, but actually he was right. There are three distinct three distinct cones in the eye that do detect color, but it's a little bit more complicated than he originally thought. So very influential. He's not done, right? Measuring frogs, this guy is prolific, right? So what he also develops out is a place theory for how we pick up on the pitch of sound. So if you're familiar with the cochlea, right? The cochlea is that snail-shaped organ in your ear, and it's liquid-filled, right? And there's a membrane in it. And what happens is when your eardrum vibrates, boom, 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 and it kind of sends waves through the cochlea and causes vibration and the basal membrane, right? And depending on where those vibrations happen, Helmholtz thought that's how we distinguish pitch, right? He is correct, but actually it's more complicated. We can hear a lot higher and lower pitch than just the membrane would suggest. So his place theory is still around, but we know that there's reverberation that occurs and a couple other instances that really create the richness of sound. But he got us started, right? And the big idea with Helmholtz is that the mind's task is to create a reasonably accurate version of reality from the various signs and signals and body sensations, and the mind is actively creating this, right? To give you a clear example, you have a blind spot over in your right and left hand upper corner of your eye, depending on where you're looking, and you don't notice it. You can't even see it, right? Because your body is actively filling in the information based upon what's around that blind spot. Same thing with audio sounds, taste, very subjective, all kinds of good stuff. So Helmholtz starts us on this idea that the brain is actively constructing our world. Okay, Hering, like the fish, kind of, sort of. So he started to look at Helmholtz's theory of vision. He also studied space perception, depth perception. He said it was innate characteristics based upon the spacing of the eye, kind of fascinating. But he kind of went after Helmholtz for the reasons I kind of mentioned before. He can't really explain what's going on with color blindness. And there's also this thing called after images. If you say in Intro to Psych, if you stared in the black and white flag and then looked to, closed your eyes and you kind of saw the red, white, and blue, it's kind of a neat effect. I usually do it in class, but it's really hard to do it if you aren't in person. But what he proposed is that there's an opponent process, is that there was a cell in there that was connected to blue and yellow, because if you stare at blue and then close your eyes, it turns yellow. And that there was a red and green and a dark and a light opponent. And when one was activated, it actually suppressed the other. But when you stop the system, the one that was suppressing becomes weaker. It kind of like wears out like a muscle and becomes active. That's how you get those after images. And it works for red and green colorblind, because we know people that are red and green colorblind still see blue, yellow, and black and white. So he's able to really explain things that Helmholtz's theory was not able to do. Now, who's right? Well, the lady we'll talk about actually combined the two. She's next. But really what happened is we found out that there was in fact cones for red, green, and blue. So Helmholtz was correct at the level of the retina. But as you move up, there's ganglion cells that actually combine the sensations from blue and red and green to create yellow. And the issue with red and green color blindness actually takes place at the ganglion cells. So that red-green you seen down there, that's actually where the malformation or the issue is with red and green color blindness. So you still have red and a green receptor. It's just the ganglion cells. So it's kind of like a really cool theory because it explains or it shows that they're both right? It's just at different levels of the processing of information. Christine Ladd, our first woman so far in the course. Now, Christine, she was a feminist, right? No, seriously, she was a huge part of the feminist movement. She actually got her family to allow her to continue her education by saying that she was too plain and uninteresting for anyone to marry her. So they couldn't marry her off, so they had to let her continue her education so she can support herself. Not making this up, right? She then got into graduate school by applying with all her accomplishments, and she put C. Ladd. And because only men were allowed to obtain such education, it's not for the feminine species. And once they found out the C stood for Christine, oh my gosh, all hell broke loose. But luckily, one of the faculty there, a renowned mathematician, supported her entry. and the faculty worked to provide her with lectures individually because she was not allowed to attend them with the men. So it's not like, oh, they kind of don't want, they literally do not allow women to do this, right? She went on to study color vision, and she proposed a theory that kind of combined both Helmholtz and the opponent processes theory. She wasn't exactly right, but she was darn close that they were both right. So kind of made huge strides in the field for women. So kind of awesome, right? Side note, she earned her doctorate in graduate school and did all the coursework, but they didn't give it to her because she's a girl. She only received her doctorate when she was 70 because the institution finally allowed women to have them. I'm serious. Can't make this stuff up. Okay, early research into brain function and what makes our personal characteristics, right? One of the first, and this great dates back to the Greeks, is physiognomy. That's face, right? So up in the right-hand corner, you can see that gentleman. He's got like a beak-like nose, right? And the idea is that because his face is shaped, right? Maybe his ancestry was influenced by birds. He's a bird brain, right? You have the curly-faced person, this idea down there, he's kind of lion, pride. You have the straight face. And physiognomy actually took hold even stronger because, photographs, right? You can start to photograph all these faces of criminals and figure out what does the face of a criminal look like, right? It's kind of a classic cartoon, either Walt Disney or Warner Brothers, and you have this look of a criminal, right? If you're a fan of Roger Rabbit, and Jessica Rabbit says, I'm not evil, I'm just drawn this way, right? So we know just because what you look like on your face doesn't mean you're evil or good. But as a side note, beautiful people are often viewed as more good than ugly people. Like if you have the exact same characteristics and explanation and just put a beautiful person's picture, an ugly person's picture, boom, what they did is immediately ranked better based upon the beauty of a person. So while we know the face doesn't make you good or evil or is an expression of that good or evil, we still unconsciously kind of use it. So kind of neat there. Now we're on to phrenology. So Franz Gall kind of came up with the first really cohesive theory about phrenology. And if you're not familiar with what that is, it's basically the bumps and depressions of your skull indicate key areas of your character, right? So there's the idea that certain aspects of yourself are located kind of throughout the skull. We'll kind of get to that, but basically there's a lot of different theories about what area equals what, and Gall kind of bring it all together and synthesized it. There are a lot of different views exactly what area means what, but Gall's was the first to kind of bring it all together. Johann Spurzheim, he kind of popularized this method with books and demonstrations. He used to go to like parlors for rich women and sit around and rub their skulls to tell them all about their characteristics. It very much had the feel of astrology, but it was based upon, the idea that there's localized functions, so specific areas of the brain do specific things, and therefore if you felt the skull, you can feel whether or not that area is well developed or not. So let's take a little bit closer look at this. So phrenology, here's an example of the picture. Each area of the brain could either be depressed or expanded upon, right? So number 13, for instance, you'd rub the area. Number 13 is like back of your skull, kind of high up, and you can rub there and feel, ooh, whoa, I got a big bump back there. That means I have lots and lots of self-esteem. It became a formal discipline. People would get trained in this. And it's the mental muscle, right? So if you work out your arms and get some sick guns, right, bro? You have swelling of the muscle that would push against the skin. It means you have bigger muscles in that area. Well, why not the brain? Well, we know that the brain sits in fluid now, right? That fluid does not usually, unless you hit your head, push against the skull, but you also have the arachnoid layer and all these other different layers between you and the skull itself. So the actual bump out of the brain area would never produce any kind of bump in relation to the skull. And we know the skull is, the cerebral cortex, the main area surrounding the outside of the brain, at least on top and the sides, is very wrinkly, and you don't see all those wrinkles in your skull. So it was wrong. We know that now, but this was a really first attempt to be scientific and matter of fact and figure out exactly what was going on from brain to your character and who you were. Ah, yes, Pierre Flourens, a good Frenchman named Pierre. Who doesn't like that? Okay, so he was a neurologist, and he was kind of finding faults with the phrenologist's view of the world. So he started to use this method called ablation, where you destroy parts of the brain. Now, he didn't do this on humans that we know of, right? Mostly rabbits, birds, some puppies. Oh, poor puppies. And what you would do is, the phrenologist would say, well, the back of Professor's brain and the skull, number 13, is where his self-esteem is. So Pierre would go in there and he would damage that area in relation to what you would assume would be self-esteem based upon the phrenologist's view of the skull. And of course, we know now that he did not find that those areas of damage were related to the labels of phrenology. Right? He was basically the phrenologist's worst nightmare, because he was like, oh yeah, that's related to this. Oh, I'll go damage it. Well, it did something completely different, right? And he also observed that when you damage certain areas, the animal would actually regain the functionality lost later on, that the brain could somehow heal itself. And we're familiar with this idea as neuroplasticity. So pretty interesting, kind of put a nail in the coffin of phrenology. Okay, now on to Paul Broca and Carl Wernicke. So these two gentlemen were studying the brain and found localization of language. Broca is responsible for speech production. He noted that damage to this area would cause basically like a word salad to occur in the brain. And Carl Wernicke, he found the speech comprehension area. And this furthered our idea and understanding of localization in the brain, because these areas for most adults exist only in the left hemisphere and not in the right. Okay, moving on. Okay, Fritsch and Hitzig, electrophysiology. basically, remember we talked about destroying parts of the brain. Instead of destroying them outright, these two gentlemen started to stimulate the brains of dogs using electrodes. It's pretty much what you think. You put an electrode there, you give it a little zap, and see what happens. They found out that the cortex was not insensitive, that it caused movement when it was stimulated. There was kind of a debate whether or not because it wasn't connected to a sense organ, what type of processing the cerebral cortex did. And what they found is an area responsible for muscle movements in the motor cortex. Well, we now know it's the motor cortex. It's a motor sensory cortex, in fact. They also found that the information crossed over. So stimulation on the right side of the brain produced movement on the left side of the body and vice versa. I mean, we know that now. It seems pretty obvious, but back then they had no idea that sensory and motor information crossed over the brain. Okay, all of this kind of culminated into the rise of experimental psychology. Basic idea, we know conscious sensations are triggered by brain responses initiated by sense receptors. So basically, when you feel something on your hand, right, it travels up into the brain, and the brain creates the conscious sensation. Things we've been talking about the whole time, right? But it all kind of leads up to this idea. So I'm a little biased. I am an experimental psychologist by training, and this is kind of the beginning of the field that I'm a part of, and it's pretty significant, right? But how are the actual conscious events, the mental events, related to the physiological systems, right? This won't actually be solved until much later when we start to actually get into neuroscience, way later, or neuropsychology or cognitive neuroscience, right? But right now, they're starting to develop some theories and ideas about how these processes of sensation in the brain actually create the conscious experience. Ernst Weber, a good German man, he mapped the sensitivity of touch throughout the whole entire body, right? So it was a stick, right? You can think of it like a ruler, and on that ruler there was a pin, and then a pin that you can move, right? So you can move the two pins closer together or farther apart and get an idea of how sensitive, when do those two touches feel like one, right? And the most sensitive area is your tongue, your face, lips, hands are pretty sensitive, feet too. But things like your back aren't very sensitive. So you'd have to move the two pins very far apart to be able to tell that was two different touches on the back. And we know that's related to the sensory cortex in the brain, that things like the face and the hands and the tongue and the lips and stuff like that they get much more neuronal processing power, right? More of the brain is dedicated to processing that information. He developed out the idea of a just notable difference, or J&D. Basically, how much of a difference between two things do you need to know that they are in fact different? This is related to his mapping of touch, right? How much distance do you need between those two pins to tell that they are in fact two different touches? But as we'll see, this creates kind of a whole nother law in psychology. So Weber's law, right? This is a law that says the change that you need between two stimuli is a percent change, not an absolute amount, right? So on the bottom right-hand chart, you can see that the K constant in Weber's law for light is 8%. What does that mean? Well, if you show somebody two different light sources, you would actually need an 8% difference for them to notice. And that goes from bright light to low light. It doesn't matter if the light is really bright or very dim, you're still going to need an 8% change. Weight, only 2%. So we're a little bit more sensitive to weight. Tones, you need about 3%. So we do know that, in fact, we're able to tell the difference in sound much easier than we are for light. So we normally think of ourselves as a visually driven species. That may actually not be true. Our hearing is much more sensitive to change than our light is. And we find just noticeable difference, this Weber's law, occurring in all kinds of things, from smell to even research I'm interested in is time perception. You need a percent change to be able to tell the difference of two different durations. So it is a fraction or a percent that's pretty constant, regardless if it's low, high, or medium. Interestingly, you should know that at the very ends, when things are like very, very, very bright and they stress the system, or very, very dim, for instance, and you can almost not even see it, the Weber fraction or the Weber's law does break down a little bit. So you do need more change than you would suspect if you're stressing the system. Okay, guys, we are in the home stretch, right? One more guy left. That's Fechner. He was curious about the relationship between the mind and the body. Super smart guy, went off to college at 16, got his medical degree by 21. Whoa, look at him go. But some of his ideas wouldn't stand the test of time, right? So he very much was an animist. He believed that all objects had a soul or a power. Think of it kind of like Star Wars with the midichlorians, kind of, if you want to geek out on that. And he started to look at how he could measure the mind in relation to the body. It's very similar to what we'd looked before, but Fechner is considered the father of experimental psychology because he was so extremely diligent, testing every single aspect of it. His area, we call it now psychophysics. That's something I do. I test very specifically the time perception with repeated measures, that kind of stuff. He also speculated, kind of took Weber's law and kind of extended it. He created Fechner's law, is what we call it. And we started to understand that the perception, that the mental representation is more of a logarithmic experience. Remember in the last slide I said, well, towards the end and towards the beginning, we get some issues. And that's where Fechner's law kind of comes into play. Fechner did extensive research in psychology. He looked at absolute thresholds. This is the lowest amount of stimuli needed to perceive that it is there. So he did this with visual fields, weights, you name it. That's why he's kind of considered the father of psychology, just as an extensive amount of research. He looked at the difference threshold. This is kind of extending out Weber's research, detected difference between two stimuli, and he actually developed new methodologies for finding these limits, right? So the method of limits is just kind of keep presenting stimuli so the person couldn't see it anymore, or couldn't hear it, or it's too high pitched, you name it. There's also a method of constant stimuli. So what he would do is randomly present stimuli of high and low qualities all around this threshold. And that was meant to keep people from guessing whether it was higher or lower, or if they saw a stimuli or not, because it would be randomly presented. And probably his most innovative was the method of adjustment, where he actually had participants themselves turn a knob or use a lever to increase or decrease the stimuli to match another stimuli. And you can actually get a sense of someone's kind of wiggle room, right? How accurate can they be? And last but not least, he has his own day, October 22nd, Fechner Day. Right, Fechner was pretty sick for a lot of his life. In fact, he was doing experiments with after images by, staring at the sun. And he tremendously damaged his eyes. He spent hours and hours trying to recover his sight by spending time in dark rooms. If you notice on the last slide, he had those really thick glasses. He couldn't see very well and he couldn't read after those experiments. But it said that after suffering a high fever, he woke October 22nd with this deep insight between the relationship of sensation and perception were keenly connected. So October 22nd, crack open a cold one for Senor Fechner.